Hi, this is Daphne's autobiography, and I'm reading it for her. Daphne, this is your life. Memories and Vagaries, Daphne Savage, born 15/5/1922, married 4/11/1941 to Norman Wilbur Sarney, who was born 26/9/09 and died 25/7/70. Remarried 4/2/95 to Patrick Philip Eric Savage, who was born 5/2/18 and died 21/11/02. Daphne Joan Lomas, early years. I was born in Auckland a few months after my parents arrived from London. My father was a full-time soldier with the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was based mainly on Gibraltar for the 5 years before the First World War. He was then sent to France, was wounded, partly blinded, sent back to England for treatment, then transferred to an army hospital where he was trained to work in an army dispensary and X-ray department. I still have X-rays showing fragments in his head of the shrapnel which blinded him in one eye. Also, I have other films which he took of my mother's foot, still wearing her shoes, showing not only the bones but also, of course, all the nails and eyelets in the boots she was wearing at the time. I have been told that the quality of the films is excellent, although they were taken almost 100 years ago. My mother was directed during the First World War to work as an accountant at the offices of the Kingston-on-Thames Borough Council. She later became interested in assisting with the work of Dr. Marie Stopes, who was a pioneer in advocating the teaching of contraceptive methods to women, especially to those from the poorer parts of London. My mother became one of the earliest suffragettes in London, so now you know where I get my stroppy streak from. My parents came to live in New Zealand in 1921. I grew up in Auckland. I always wanted to work in a scientific field, so in 1938 I was delighted to be accepted by the director of the laboratory at Auckland Hospital to be trained in general laboratory practice. At the time, our work included microbiology, biochemistry, hematology, and the study of blood grouping and blood transfusion. At that time, 70 years ago, the sum total of staff was only 26, but it expanded very rapidly over the next few years. We all expected to be fully trained, but I did not have the opportunity to complete my study of biochemistry because in 1940, during the Second World War, the decision was made to establish an official blood bank at the hospital, and under the supervision of a senior pathologist, I was deployed to be the first blood bank technician in Auckland. I then concentrated on hematology. I remained there for the next 4 years, responsible for organising a supply of blood for transfusions, working on the usual blood typing and cross-matchings, and on the study of the newly discovered Rh factor. Part 2. Laboratory Days. The term Rh is an abbreviation of rhesus, a type of monkey whose blood carries a factor which reacts with human blood. This factor can cause jaundice and sometimes death in newborn infants. Dr. Selwyn Hills, our pathologist, wanted to extend his knowledge and was given permission by the Auckland Zoo to obtain some blood from one of their rhesus monkeys. The memory of the efforts of this determined, very dishevelled doctor and a zookeeper to catch a monkey and extract a little bit of its blood remain with me as one of my laboratory highlights. If you've ever watched a monkey racing around its cage at top speed, you'll know what was involved. It definitely did not want to be caught. But although we were all sorry to distress the poor little fellow temporarily, the work done then has been invaluable for the babies who have been saved by the knowledge gained at that time. We worked very hard on 6 days per week and no overtime, but I still think very fondly of how much we all enjoyed it, and I love to recall some of the humorous situations we got ourselves into. Our days were very varied. One part of our regular work was on behalf of the health department, who brought us, among other specimens, samples of water from city beaches to be tested for bacterial count. These included samples of seawater from the Aoraki sewage outlet, which at that time was based in Okahu Bay. One of our pathologists decided that we should do an independent collection ourselves. So he and 3 assistants went to Aoraki, armed with sample jars to collect specimens from the seabed, first at high tide, then again at low tide, after the sewage had been discharged. One of the staff donned a mask and dived to the seabed with his collection jars. Unfortunately, we had all miscalculated the time when the sewage release valves were to be opened. So, while he was still underwater, you can guess what happened next. Well, it did give the term brown-nosing an accurate meaning. We had plenty of laughter in between all the serious stuff. In the late 1930s, only one small private laboratory was operating in Auckland. This was eventually taken over by several of the former Auckland hospital pathologists, and it became the Diagnostic Laboratory. Over the years, this lab also expanded enormously and became one of the best private labs in the world. In Germany, there is a laboratory where checks are done to assess the standards of hundreds of private labs throughout the world, and Diagnostic Lab was ranked as 6th in 1 year at least. A really excellent result. I am still very upset that such an outstanding service has been replaced by a less comprehensive one. In 1941, I was appointed to run the blood bank at Auckland Hospital, a role I held for 3 years. The blood bank consisted of a room with 3 refrigerators. Part 3. Marriage and Family. Norm and I were married on the 4th of January 1941 in St David's Church, Auckland, where the colours of the 1st Field Company of Engineers were hung. Norm was always a very keen territorial soldier with the engineers, and I was very proud that he was chosen to be one of the 48 servicemen to represent New Zealand at the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth in 1937. I was reminded of this recently by the film The King's Speech. Norm was one of the soldiers seen marching through London. In common with men from other Commonwealth countries, he did a half-hour duty outside Buckingham Palace. The British government were very kind to the representatives and arranged for them to visit many places of interest, including Nelson's ship, the Victory, and a visit to Scotland and Edinburgh Castle. The contingent from New Zealand were senior officers from the Army, Navy and Air Force, a Member of Parliament, Erawera Tirikatini, and 3 Victoria Cross holders, Leslie William Andrews, VC, Samuel Frickleton, VC, and James Crichton, VC. I have the signatures of them all on the menu of a farewell dinner which was held on the Rangatiki, the ship on which they returned home. Between 1941 and 1942, while I was working in the laboratory, Norm was in the Army, based in Fiji. He returned to attend an officer training course at Trentham, followed by 6 months in the Rotorua remedial camp, training Grade 2 medically unfit soldiers before he was sent to the Pacific War Zone. For a further 2 years' service in New Caledonia, Vella La Vella, Mono Island, Nisan, Treasury Island, Green Island, Espirito Santo, Guadalcanal, and Bougainville. It was not until he returned in 1945 that we were able to settle down and the first of our first 3 sons was born. When the children grew older, I returned to part-time work at the hospital in the evenings, this time helping to nurse children who were being treated for tuberculosis. Because of my earlier daily contact in the laboratory with pathological specimens infected with the tubercle bacillus, I had developed pretty strong immunities, so had no fears about catching TB or passing it on. The next 25 years after the war were happy ones for us, bringing up our family. But sadly, in 1970, my husband suffered a sudden heart attack and died. My youngest son was 16 then, and I needed to work again, But although I was invited to rejoin the laboratory, I felt unable to cope at that time with learning new technologies. So I was pleased when some GPs I had known in my hospital days invited me to work for them as a nurse receptionist on a part-time basis. I stayed with them for about 7 years, but when their practice expanded, they needed full-time assistance, so I changed to working for another doctor. In both practices, I had been able to continue with doing the sort of minor laboratory work which is done in most surgeries. Part 4. New Enterprises. After a further 7 years working in general medical practice, I felt that I needed another change, and this time decided to try something completely different. I joined a building firm, Universal Homes, and learned to use office equipment and machines like Xerox, etc. I acted as hostess in their show homes, and most fun of all was given the use of a company car and the responsibility of driving to all their building sites throughout Auckland to deliver the weekly wages to their building staff. In those days, wages were always paid in cash. Never before this had I been accorded such a welcome by so many men in any one day, and it all happened again for me the next week, and the next. Wonderful job, no worries, and the highest income I had ever earned. However, only a year later, I accepted an invitation to become the executive secretary of the Tuberculosis and Chest Disease Association, which was based at Green Lane Hospital. I agreed in the first place to work for them for a short time until I turned 60, when I expected to retire. But somehow the short time turned into 17 years. I finally retired at 72. Mine was the responsibility for arranging fundraising campaigns and the subsequent distribution of the funds, with the support and assistance of a wonderful voluntary committee, headed by the Governor-General as patron, and including the Mayor, a stockbroker, a solicitor, doctors, businessmen, and a number of very kind ladies who, among other things, distributed comforts to the patients. In the 1990s, I became the Vice President of the New Zealand Federation of TB and Chest Disease Associations. It was because I needed to attend one of their meetings, held in Christchurch, that I was unable to be in Auckland on the day before the flight, to call at the office of Air New Zealand to pay my fare for a trip, which I had booked by telephone. This meant that I missed out on being able to fly to the Antarctic on the disastrous Mount Erebus flight. The pilot of the flight was Captain Jim Collins, whose wife Maria was also a former laboratory staff member. Patrick's daughter Debbie was an Air New Zealand hostess at the time. She was scheduled to fly that day, but because she had already done the Antarctic flight previously, she agreed to change duties with another hostess who wanted to go on it. I had told my family and some friends that I expected to be on board, but had not had time to tell them that I had had to postpone the date. They did not find out till the next morning that I was still around. I hope that they were not too disappointed. I had gained some of my knowledge of the Antarctic from a family friend, David Massam, who wrote a book which was used by the Education Board for teaching primary school pupils. I learned more from Howard O'Kane, after whom a glacier and a canyon in the area are named, and lastly from my grandson, Michael Sarney, who spent 2 months in the Antarctic. He took some wonderful video films during the time when he was servicing and flying in helicopters while he was in the New Zealand Air Force. Section 5. Travel. It was not until about 1971 that I finally had the time and opportunity to travel a bit further than Australia. I had my first visit to America and to Canada, visiting friends and places which had been only a dream in earlier years. I stayed first in Hawaii, where I was to meet Roger and Margaret Erickson. But because I arrived first at the hotel where we were staying, I decided to have a much-needed rest and to order a meal to be sent to my room. Big mistake. At that point, I had not realised that I should have tipped the staff who showed me to the room. Consequently, no one responded to my call. After waiting half an hour, I decided to give up and go downstairs to a cafe on the street below. I sat myself on a vacant stool and ordered a coffee and some food. Sitting next to me, literally touching my arm, was a very interesting-looking woman, well-dressed, heavily made up, and wearing very large diamond rings on her hands. She finished her meal and departed. Then a very excited waitress came to me and told me that my companion was the actress Betty Davis. My first contact with an American celebrity. Another was Danny Kaye, who was just emerging from a stage door on Broadway as we were passing. We had been to see a revival of the old show No, No, Nanette, with many of the original cast performing, including Ruby Keeler, Patsy Kelly, and Busby Berkeley. They were wonderful. Next, I met Murray on his ship in Tacoma, near Seattle, and with Joe Coker, we sailed up Puget Sound to Everett, near the Canadian border. I visited friends in Vancouver and Coquitlam, went back to Seattle, then to Minneapolis to stay with Margaret. Roger paid for us to have a trip to New York, where, by courtesy of Roger's friend Hubert Humphrey, we were given a tour of the United Nations building. We sat in the President's chair in the Congress Hall, were shown a piece of rock which had just been brought back by the space shuttle, and were invited to lunch in the Delegates' dining room with the ambassador from Swaziland, Naf Dlamini. Eat your heart out, Helen Clark. I did all the things which tourists do, climbed up the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty. Then on my way home, I visited Disneyland. Later, I did a tour of canyonlands, including Grand Canyon. It has always been one of my ambitions to climb in the canyon, and was delighted that I managed to, in spite of having broken my femur not very long before. Another highlight was flying over Monument Valley, a most spectacular place. Another ambition fulfilled was to visit the San Diego Zoo, to see the village where the America's Cup team were based, and to visit Las Vegas, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. I also visited the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, where I was given a tour of their blood bank and shown some of their latest blood transfusion techniques. A special memory which gives me comfort is that I was able to enjoy some travel with Murray in Sydney and in the States and Canada before his premature death from a heart attack on the 25th of November, 1986. Part 6. New Chapter in Life. During my time working in a general medical practice, I had become very friendly with Margot Savage, who was one of the doctors also working there. We had much in common, including interests in our children, pets, wildlife, and the bush. We enjoyed visits in our spare time to the Manukau Harbour, West Coast beaches, and Whangaparoa. Margot's husband sometimes joined us on these trips, which is how I came to know Patrick Savage. Some years later, Margot became seriously ill. Then, to everyone's distress, she died. She had been a wonderful woman, much loved by her family and much admired by her many friends. Both Patrick and I missed Margot terribly, but life must go on. We continued with our friendship, which later became closer, so we decided to marry and had 8 happy years together until he, too, passed on. Patrick had been the medical superintendent of Oakley Hospital, specialising in forensic psychiatry. Some of the patients who passed through his hands had also been among those who had required treatment for tuberculosis and were known to me as well, which gave us further points of mutual interest. We also had a shared interest in the Medical History Society, to which I still belong, the Selwyn Society, the Eden Garden Society, the Miranda Wildlife Trust, and the National Party. After Patrick retired, he became the secretary of the local New Lynn and Mount Roskill branches of the party. As well as attending their general meetings, we were involved in minor fundraising for them and hosted a number of fundraising events. The most memorable one of those, for me, was Mrs. Savage Bouquet's candlelit dinner for important people. You will probably recall the TV program Keeping Up Appearances, with the pretentious Mrs. Bouquet, pronounced bouquet, not bucket, her long-suffering husband and awful brother, Onslow. Patrick dressed up as Onslow, complete with sleeveless pullover, no shirt, and stick-on tattoos. I was the elaborately dressed Mrs. Bouquet, and the important people were our hopeful parliamentary candidates. Our special guest was Dorena Gardner, a friend from the Green Lane Hospital days, who had made quite a name for herself impersonating the Queen, to whom she bore a remarkable resemblance. She arrived at our house in a beautiful long cream satin gown, wearing a diamond crown, many strings of pearls, carrying a plate of cucumber sandwiches, and looking very regal. She certainly impressed Mrs. Bouquet with her importance. We charged everyone $10 and a plate of food for the shared dinner. All good fun and quite profitable in a small way. In conclusion, I must mention how much Patrick and I enjoyed our retirement together. We had many good times at his holiday home in Nongataha, where he could go trout fishing again, and had some trips around New Zealand, catching up with people and places we had not been able to see enough of during our working days. We have both been very fortunate with our families and friends. And here in your autobiography are some mementos from the Royal Garden Party, and I shall read out what they say. Royal Visit, 1995, Entry Card, Dr. Patrick Savage, Mrs. Savage, Government House, Auckland, the Royal Garden Party. And then there are some photos. And then the next section has a header with a crown on it and ER2 as the insignia. And written underneath it says, the Comptroller of the Household has received Her Majesty's command to invite Dr. and Mrs. Patrick Savage to a garden reception to be given at Government House, Auckland, by the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, the 8th of November, 1995. Wonderful. Part 6, New Chapter in Life, which those mementos are from partway through that period. During my time working in a general medical practice, I had become very friendly with Margot Savage, who was one of the doctors also working there. We had much in common, including interests in our children, pets, wildlife, and the bush. We enjoyed visits in our spare time to the Manukau Harbour, West Coast beaches, and Whangaparoa. Margot's husband sometimes joined us on these trips, which is how I came to know Patrick Savage. Some years later, Margot became seriously ill, then to everyone's distress, she died. She had been a wonderful woman, much loved by her family and much admired by her many friends. Both Patrick and I missed Margot terribly, but life must go on. We continued with our friendship, which later became closer, so we decided to marry and had 8 happy years together until he, too, passed on. Patrick had been the medical superintendent of Oakley Hospital, specialising in forensic psychiatry. Some of the patients who passed through his hands had also been among those who had required treatment for tuberculosis and were known to me as well, which gave us further points of mutual interest. We also had a shared interest in the Medical History Society, to which I still belong, the Selwyn Society, the Eden Garden Society, the Miranda Wildlife Trust, and the National Party. After Patrick retired, he became the secretary of the local New Lynn and Mount Roskill branches of the party. As well as attending their general meetings, we were involved in minor fundraising for them and hosted a number of fundraising events. The most memorable one of those for me was Mrs. Savage Bucket's candlelit dinner for important people. You will probably recall the TV program Keeping Up Appearances with the pretentious Mrs. Bucket, pronounced Bouquet, Mrs. Bouquet, her long-suffering husband and awful brother, Onslow. Patrick dressed up as Onslow, complete with sleeveless pullover, no shirt, and sticker-on tattoos. I was the elaborately dressed Mrs. Bouquet, and the important people were our hopeful parliamentary candidates. Our special guest was Dorena Gardner, a friend from Green Lane Hospital days who had made quite a name for herself impersonating the Queen, to whom she bore a remarkable resemblance. She arrived at our house in a beautiful long cream satin gown, wearing a diamond crown, many strings of pearls, carrying a plate of cucumber sandwiches, and looking very regal. She certainly impressed Mrs. Bouquet with her importance. We charged everyone $10 and a plate of food for the shared dinner. All good fun and quite profitable in a small way. In conclusion, I must mention how much Patrick and I enjoyed our retirement together. We had many good times at his holiday home in Nongataha, where he could go trout fishing again, and had some trips around New Zealand, catching up with people and places we had not been able to see enough during our working days. We have both been very fortunate with our families and friends. After Patrick's death, I returned to live in Milford again. I joined the North Shore branch of the Government Superannuitants Association, becoming their chairman for 1 year and continuing as a member of their executive committee. I still belong to the Medical History Society, the Eden Garden Society, the Miranda Wildlife Trust, and the North Shore Performers Club, and was honoured to be elected as a life member of the Tuberculosis and Chest Diseases Association, which is now known as Lung Health Auckland. But most importantly, I joined the Takapuna North Probus Club, which has given me more pleasure than any other club with which I have been involved. The trips I have had with Probus have taken me to so many places I would not have visited had I been alone. I am very grateful to them. And the rest, as they say, is history in the making. Happy memories to look back on. Cruising Puget Sound with Murray, touring the South Island with Jeff, cracking the ton at the wheel of his MGB, flying over the Southern Alps and down Skipper's Canyon, visiting the seal colony in Kaikoura, travelling in the USA with Margaret Erickson, travelling in the USA and Canada with Kay and Ed Lynch, travelling in the USA with Joe and Keith Coker, and climbing Crystal Mountain, holidays with Norm and the boys at Wellington, Rotorua, Taupo, National Park, Ruapehu, Northland, McLaren's Falls, and on Selwyn Hills Farm at Hokianga. Flying Joe Tyson's dual-controlled plane from Hokianga to Pukekohe. Flights in helicopters in a DC-3 and flights with Fred Ladd and a Grumman Widgeon to Rotorua and Waiheke. Visiting Zion Park with Bob, nursing a 6-week-old tiger cub and feeding it and baby lion cubs. Christmas dinner with Bob and the Gannets at Muriwai, playing the guitar and singing to 800 Plunkett mothers at Mount Albert. At Mount Albert Memorial Hall with Viv Williamson playing piano and Paul Harrop on drums. Tramping at Wakatipu and the West Coast and driving a steam train at Waiuku. Flights with Jeff and Maureen and with my grandchildren in small planes from the North Shore Aero Club. Concluding with the thought of how fortunate I have been to have had so many wonderful experiences to outweigh the inevitable sad events which happen from time to time in everybody's lifetime. Life has been good to me, and I sincerely hope that you will all be able to say the same when old age creeps up on you too. The next few pages are from the life story of Janie Farquharson, née Winstone, regarding her trip to the coronation in 1937. She and her brother and sisters also travelled on the Rangatiki with Norm and the coronation contingent from New Zealand. They met each other on board and served on the same sports committee. Janie is the mother of one of my Probus friends, Max Farquharson, and his sister, Marion O'Kane, who printed the photos of Patrick's and my wedding. It is a small, small world. And just to make it smaller, this is a comment from your narrator. Janie Farquharson Max Farquharson, and Marion O'Kane are relatives of mine. Jenny, your reader. Excerpts from Janie Winston's story. The Grand Tour. In April 1937, the younger members of the family, Janie, then 23, Hilda, Beryl, and Bruce, sailed on the Rangatiki via Panama Canal for a European holiday that would also take in the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, then later to become the Queen Mother. Janie's words. Beryl was a qualified kindergarten teacher by then. I was about 23, and Hilda had been looking after us and doing the housework and being mother's good right-hand girl all those years, and Bruce was through his university, and I, of course, was newly engaged to Colin, and we had been going together for ages, but in the slump time he was only earning £5 per week. Nobody got married very quickly in those days. Hilda and Dad had their heads together about this trip for ages, and they had been to the Rangatiki. Dad said, well, I've got news for you. Hilda and Bruce are going to take Beryl and you over to England to see the coronation. Oh, I said, but I'm newly engaged. I don't want to go. Oh, I thought I would get married someday. I didn't get married for years after because the slump was on and Colin couldn't get himself going, so there was plenty of time to go, and I had a lovely time going. I was glad I did. So we went and had a look at the Rangatiki, and we had a nice 4-berth cabin. Dad had got it in the nice, comfortable part of the ship. There was a cricket coach from Dunedin, an Englishman, who said, look, you folk are going through the Panama Canal. You've got 6 weeks. If you get on, you young people, you can have the most marvellous sports, so organise it. So they had a committee meeting of all the young fellows, and we invited some of the soldiers to join in too, and we made all these progressive sports on the boats. Norm was on the sports committee too. That's an aside from our biographer. Also on board was the New Zealand coronation contingent, which included a New Zealand First World War VC, James Crichton. Hilda felt especially honoured when asked by Crichton if she would sew on new ribbons to his medals, including the VC. All VCs, even to this day, are cast from the bronze of siege guns used at Sevastopol in the Crimean War that also saw the emergence of Florence Nightingale and improved military nursing. The officers in the army contingent were accommodated in second class, as were the family, and a good time was enjoyed by all. In the evenings, some of the stewards formed a dance band that included a bow played across a large builder's saw, and Janie describes the music as brilliant. They used to invite the young folk from first class to join them. The chief engineer of the ship was good fun and danced very well, singing all the while, "If you were the only girl in the world and I was the only boy," for words obtainable from the internet now. RAF version, more expensive. A special friend on board was Graham Burgess, who celebrated his 21st birthday on the voyage. The family were invited to his cabin for cake, etc., and later went to visit his fiancée in London at her place on the Thames. Her name was Bay Smallbone. Our irrepressible Kiwis swam across the Thames and back, about 300 yards wide at that point, but when I asked Janie if the pollution had not worried them, she blithely replied that if it was polluted, they didn't notice. They also took a launch trip up the river to Teddington Locks and watched the water level being pumped up to allow access to the upper reaches of the river. Bay's uncle was bailiff to the Duke of Connaught. The Duchess of Connaught was Queen Victoria's youngest daughter. They owned a magnificent estate called Bagshot, and he, the bailiff, arranged for the family to go into the park to see a field of bluebells under some large oak trees, a scene that Janie describes as being a glorious sight and scent. Bagshot is regarded as one of the best of the stately homes of England. Prince Edward, the youngest son of the present Queen, is the present owner. His interest in films and documentaries for TV, and these include a fine history of the castle and ruins of England since the days of Henry VIII. Hi, I'm Jenny and I'm continuing to read Daphne, This Is Your Life. Further note, the next few pages are from the life story of Janie Farquharson, née Winstone, regarding her trip to the coronation in 1937. She and her brother and sisters also travelled on the Rangatiki with Norm and the coronation contingent from New Zealand. They met each other on board and served on the same sports committee. Janie is the mother of one of my Probus friends, Max Farquharson, and his sister, Marion O'Kane, who printed the photos of Patrick's and my wedding. It is a small, small world. And I'm just going to interrupt here and say that as Jenny, your reader, it is indeed a small, small world because Janie Farquharson was a cousin of one of my grandmothers. So small world indeed. I shall continue reading. This section is from Janie Winstone's story. They are excerpts from her story. The Grand Tour. In April 1937, the younger members of the family, Janie, then 23, Hilda, Beryl, and Bruce, sailed on the Rangatiki via Panama Canal for a European holiday that would also take in the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Janie's words, Beryl was a qualified kindergarten teacher by then. I was about 23 and Hilda had been looking after us and doing the housework and being mother's good right-hand girl all those years, and Bruce was through his university. And I, of course, was newly engaged to Colin, and we had been going together for ages, but in the slump time, he was only earning £5 per week. Nobody got married very quickly in those days. Hilda and Dad had had their heads together about this trip for ages, and they had been to the Rangatiki. Dad said, well, I have got news for you. Hilda and Bruce are going to take Beryl and you over to England to see the coronation. Oh, I said, but I'm newly engaged. I don't want to go. Oh, I thought I would get married someday. I didn't get married for years after because the slump was on and Colin couldn't get himself going, so there was plenty of time to go, and I had a lovely time going. I was glad I did. So we went and had a look at the Rangatiki, and we had a nice 4-berth cabin. Dad had got it in the nice comfortable part of the ship. There was a cricket coach from Dunedin, an Englishman, who said, look, you folk are going through the Panama Canal. You've got 6 weeks. If you get on, you young people, you can have the most marvellous sports, so organise it. So they had a committee meeting of all the young fellows, and we invited some of the soldiers to join in too, and we made all these progressive sports on the boat. And then here's a note from Daphne. Norm was on the sports committee also. I'll carry on. Also on board was the New Zealand coronation contingent, which included a New Zealand First World War VC, James Crichton. Hilda felt especially honoured when asked by Crichton if she would sew on new ribbons to his medals, including the VC. All VCs, even to this day, are cast from the bronze of siege guns used at Sevastopol in the Crimean War that also saw the emergence of Florence Nightingale and improved military nursing. And a little side note for those who are listening to this, who aren't Daphne, who may not know, a VC is a Victoria Cross. It's a type of medal, a type of honour. The officers in the army contingent were accommodated in second class, as were the family, and a good time was enjoyed by all. In the evenings, some of the stewards formed a dance band that included a bow played across a large builder's saw, and Janie describes the music as brilliant. They used to invite the young folk from first class to join them. The chief engineer of the ship was good fun and danced very well, singing all the while, "If you were the only girl in the world, and I was the only boy." The full words are obtainable from the writer. The RAF version is more expensive. A special friend on board was Graham Burgess, who celebrated his 21st birthday on the voyage. The family were invited to his cabin for cake, etc., and later went to visit his fiancée in London at her place on the Thames. Her name was Bay Smallbone. Our irrepressible Kiwis swam across the Thames and back, about 300 yards wide at that point, but when I asked Jamie if the pollution had not worried them, she blithely replied that if it was polluted, they didn't notice. They also took a launch trip up the river to Teddington Locks and watched the water level being pumped up to allow access to the upper reaches of the river. Bay's uncle was bailiff to the Duke of Connaught. The Duchess of Connaught was Queen Victoria's youngest daughter. They owned a magnificent estate called Bagshot, and he, the bailiff, arranged for the family to go into the park to see a field of bluebells under some large oak trees, a scene that Janey describes as being a glorious sight and scent. Bagshot is regarded as one of the best of the stately homes of England. Prince Edward, the youngest son of the present Queen, is the present owner. His interest in films and documentaries for TV, and his interest is films and documentaries for TV, and these include A Fine History of the Castle and Ruins of England since the days of Henry VIII. Janey's words. We met all the people at New Zealand House and we had reunions at some of the posh restaurants in town. Then we heard that the New Zealand soldiers were going to be on guard duty at Buckingham Palace. So we all went down and saw our Tommies, busy marching up and down doing their gunslinging. They looked a bit sheepish when we were there, but they were still pleased to see some New Zealanders, you know. We would organise a few outings and things. It was lovely, really. Everybody was so free and natural, whereas today everybody pairs off. When I go on the boats today and I see the girls finding a boy and grabbing him and working hard night and day to keep him and not let anybody else have him, I think they don't know what fun they could have had if they had been in a group. So we were lucky there. The Coronation Day Parade. The family had reserved seats that had to be occupied by 5 a.m., so it was a very early start to a long day. They were seated along with other New Zealanders in St. James Street. The New Zealanders, being from the youngest Dominion, had the honour of leading the parade from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. Similarly, the procession of coaches was led by that of the Prime Minister M.J. Savage, a shy bachelor who sat in the corner of his carriage, but nevertheless cheered by Janey and co. as they recognised him. One of the most popular people in the parade was Queen Salote of Tonga. She was nearly 7 feet tall and built to suit. She was the undoubted party girl of the whole occasion and had a ball. Janey remembers that when the cannons boomed out their 21-gun salute for Queen Salote, it was widely held that the vibrations were the cause of rain all that afternoon and night. Spectators, looking in vain for shelter, bought newspapers and held them over their heads and shoulders until they were saturated and then scattered all over the roads as a white puffy mess. In the evening, the family, with some relatives and friends, congregated at the Victoria statue in front of the palace and shouted, "We want the king! We want the king!" etc., all except Janey, who yelled that she wanted the Queen, but she couldn't even hear herself. At 10 p.m. the doors on the balcony of the palace opened, and out came the royal party, who were cheered for 10 minutes. After this they followed the crowd through to Green Park and Bushy Park to home. The end of a long and wonderful day for our young Kiwis. Some weeks later, Huddy Shaw, a Takapuna boy, arranged for them to see a television show of the coronation that must have been one of the earliest TV shows to ever be produced. After the coronation, they went to Southampton to see the Spithead Naval Review of British and Empire warships. Norm, this is an aside from Daphne, Norm was also present at the Spithead Review. Then back to Janey's story. White lights outlined the hull of each ship, and all were inspected by the new King and Queen from the royal yacht. They returned late that night to London by train and wasted no time writing to their parents, thanking them for the wonderful 10 months' holiday. After the coronation, the clothes worn by the royal party were all on display at the Royal Needlewomen's College. The king had ermine over his naval uniform and had a royal blue train. The train worn by the Queen, that had 6 ladies in waiting to carry it, was a royal blue colour with centrepieces of 2 silver ferns for New Zealand, an Australian wattle and Canada's maple leaf. The dresses worn by the 2 princesses were beautiful hand-woven Honiton lace full-length frocks. The Queen knew of a village that had been settled by French refugees at the time of the French Revolution that produced the lace that looked very tasteful for the girls at their father's coronation. And that's the end of Janie's contribution to Daphne's life story. And on to the next. Inner fury unleashed in old age. Protests re-letting of laboratory services. Contract to new provider, 2009. This is a letter written on Diagnostic Medlab letterhead. Diagnostic Medlab Limited, 1st of April 2009. Honourable Tony Ryle, Minister of Health, Executive Wing, Parliament Buildings, Wellington. Dear Minister, Mrs. Daphne Savage, aged 87, is one of a huge majority of Aucklanders who are extremely worried about the potential disaster that is looming should lab tests continue in their attempt to provide community laboratory services to the Auckland region. Mrs. Savage has sent me copies of the enclosed letters which were originally sent to Dr. Wayne Mapp, the second to Lab Tests Auckland, and third letter was sent to you. Mrs. Savage is a committee member of the Government Superannuitants Association North Shore branch. At a meeting held on the 12th of March 2009, 9 committee members fully endorsed the enclosed letters, and again on Friday, the 27th of March 2009, a further 21 members of the Government Superannuitants Association North Shore branch fully endorsed these letters requesting further revision of the contract for laboratory services in Auckland. In the accompanying letter Mrs. Savage sent to me, she explained that when she spoke of her concerns at the meeting, she asked for a show of hands from those who shared her feelings. At least 90% of the attendees showed their agreement. In fact, she was congratulated by reps from other branches who said they would organise further signatures through their own branches. As a Diagnostic Medlab employee, I am humbled by the passion, depth of belief and understanding this woman has for the service the staff of DML currently provide to the Auckland region. I know that it is an impossible task for lab tests to replicate this service. I believe it is in the interest of all Aucklanders for someone like yourself to stand up and put a stop to this disaster that is waiting to happen. I know the national government and you as minister did not contribute to this ridiculous situation, but you are now in the position where you must accept the responsibility for ensuring the health of the Auckland public is not put in jeopardy. I hope you will give this matter your due consideration, and I look forward to your response. And the original was signed by S. Carpenter. And now we have a selection of newspaper clippings. Lab transition, 28th of the 8th, 09. A statement of concern for blood test patients by the Auckland District Health Board's Tim Wood was astounding. For the past 3 years, we have been reminded repeatedly that the Auckland community contract was purely a commercial issue. Diagnostic Medlab has made the commercial decision to retain some rooms. Why is there now an implied moral or ethical obligation to hand them over? The Auckland Region Health Boards failed in their duty to protect the public by signing a contract with a non-existent laboratory, fully and recklessly expecting lab tests to feed off Diagnostic Medlab for staff and intellectual property. That feed-off did not occur as expected, and the 2-week-old service is, at this early stage, already showing alarming deficiencies that are buried by euphemisms and a conspiracy of silence. Many of the problems are not just glitches or teething pains, but systemic problems arising out of a lack of know-how on the running of a complex laboratory system. Yet those who can avert a disaster remain coy about taking drastic and courageous action. What will it take? A death or a paralysis of the health service? And that was a letter to the newspaper by Dr. Mi Ling Yong of Remuera. Here's the next one. lab tests service. After a week of lab tests service in central Auckland, I would like to share my practice's experience. First, a pack, which was supposed to be delivered by Friday of the week before last, finally arrived last Tuesday. Secondly, there was a phone call from lab tests asking if an urgent and important result supposedly sent the previous evening had arrived. The answer was no. Thirdly, results have been sent to my nurse's inbox, not mine, so I was not aware of them. But most significantly, lab tests decided not to culture urine specimens if it, not the clinician, considered it unnecessary. This is obviously a cost-saving measure. When I asked for a urine specimen to be cultured after being unable to speak to a microbiologist because one was at lunch and the other was unavailable, the result showed an infection. If diagnoses are missed, patients will become more unwell and perhaps require hospital admission. So while the district health boards are saving on their laboratory contract, their overall costs may well rise. In the words of the song, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. In this case, Auckland GPs knew what they had with Diagnostic Medlab, and I hope it is not gone. Signed by Dr. Ian Rapson, General Practitioner, 3 Kings. And then from the brevities section, on the 7th of the 10th, 09, on lab tests. It is important for all to know that there has been no improvement in lab tests' performance over the last 2 weeks of media silence. Dr. John Foy. Then back to a standard length letter. On the 1st of the 9th, 09, DML performance. A Herald editorial on the laboratory contract gave deserved credit for the excellent services provided by Diagnostic Medlab for well over 60 years. Only time will tell if lab tests is capable of supplying the same level of service, just as the time will be needed to prove whether the challenges will result in substantial financial benefits. Meanwhile, Diagnostic Medlab should not be criticised but should be strongly applauded for the efforts it has been making to remain operational. This will enable it to provide backup services to patients and doctors if the need arises. It has every right to retain its own records and intellectual property and to retain its leases on premises used as collection centres. It should certainly not be criticised by the Herald for creating anxiety in the public arena. As stated by your correspondent, Mi Ling Yong, the District Health Boards failed the public by signing a contract with what at the time was a non-existent laboratory, and which even now does not provide the same level of convenience for patients. If lab tests operation should prove to be a disaster for any patient, a certain amount of responsibility lies with the Supreme Court judges who saw no legal reason to overturn the contract, but failed to give sufficient consideration to the views of the vast majority of the public and members of the medical profession who wanted the existing service to continue. Signed by Daphne Savage of Milford. At our Daphne, I would think. Lab contract 16/10/09. Returning 10% of laboratory work to Diagnostic Medlab is a move in the right direction, but much more must be done. The remaining 90% of the contract should also be restored to it as soon as possible to enable doctors and their patients to again feel confident of receiving prompt and accurate results, which can be backed up by easy access to familiar and trusted pathologists. Full confidence in lab tests' ability to provide a dependable service has now been destroyed by its substandard performance. It is now unlikely that it will ever gain the complete trust of GPs and others who have been frustrated or infuriated by mistakes, omissions, or faulty results. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have been wasted as the result of lab tests' inefficiency. Rather than allow the current deplorable situation to continue for the next 8 years, the Auckland District Health Boards should terminate its contract on the grounds of failure to provide a satisfactory level of service. The time has come for lab tests to concede it has misjudged its ability to fulfill its obligations and withdraw gracefully. And that is signed Daphne Savage, Milford. This one's dated the 29th of the 8th, 09. Lab contract. Diagnostic Medlab's interviewing of patients attending the new lab tests collection depots is surprising in that it assumes any information gathered and passed on would be treated seriously by the Auckland District Health Boards. This hardly seems likely. No serious attempt was made to gauge public or professional opinion before the decision to change the laboratory provider. Only somewhat later, perhaps to placate the wider community, was consultation undertaken. But results that showed the public and medical profession overwhelmingly did not support a change were buried until extracted by the Official Information Act. At a meeting I later attended for GPs to provide suggestions, it was strongly put to Tim Wood of the District Health Boards that a before and after survey should be done of all those involved. It was strongly emphasised that this should be done by an independent third party to eliminate observer bias. Was it done? No. If the health boards alone are to monitor this service, that together with the amount of ego and public money invested to start this venture, means I never expect to hear an admission such as Auckland, we have a problem. Signed by Dr. John Kyle of Albany. The next few are all in the brevities section of the letters to the editor. 9909. On lab contract. Medical laboratories were once funded directly by the health department and should be again. I doubt that lay district health boards are competent to make medical decisions of this kind. Apart from the boards, virtually no one, doctors or patients, wanted this change. Dr. Bill Stevens of Remuera. Also from the same day, the only saving the district health boards are getting from the laboratory contract is that patients are willing to go to the few diagnostic medlab rooms open and pay for their publicly funded tests because of lab tests inadequacies. And that's from Don Simanu of Onehunga. And then the next two are, the next one is from on the 8th of the 9th, 09. On lab contract. More and more GPs are complaining about the service provided by lab tests. They are the front line of our health system and should be listened to very seriously. Catherine Curlett, Remuera. 16th of the 4th, 09. On lab contract. The public has made it clear that no changes to the laboratory contract are wanted. That view should be heeded. The best outcome would be for lab tests to concede it has underestimated the difficulties it is encountering and to withdraw gracefully the rights to the contract. And that is signed by our Daphne Savage of Milford. And this is the page of letters to the editor that were published in 2009 regarding the debacle. And now we have a copy of a certificate. I'll see if I can show you the certificate. It won't be very clear. There you go. And I shall read to you the different parts on the certificate. It is from the Auckland Tuberculosis and Chest Diseases Association Incorporated. In recognition of dedicated service to the Auckland Tuberculosis and Chest Diseases Association Incorporated, life membership is hereby awarded to Mrs. Daphne Savage, and it is signed by A. something or other Harrison, who's the chairman, the deputy chairman, whose signature I can't read, and the secretary, who I believe is Bev Swan. And it's dated the 20th of the 8th, I think, 1996. And it has the seal, the common seal of the Auckland Tuberculosis and Chest Diseases Association Incorporated. Wonderful. Here's another extract from a newspaper. This is from page 20 of the Western Leader on Tuesday, November the 3rd, 1981. Oakley superintendent runs tight ship. And then it's a section, obviously, that they were doing a regular thing that was called Inside Carrington and Oakley by Fran Pardon. And then I shall read the actual text of the article. The man behind Oakley Psychiatric Hospital is Dr. Pat Savage, superintendent since 1965. A distinguished man with silver hair, Dr. Savage exudes an air of quiet competence, leaving one with an impression he could handle any situation. Perhaps bred to a more refined life, he deals with the seamier side of human nature with equanimity and objectivity. His remarkably unlined face cracks easily into smiles, a sense of humour which helps him run a tight ship and retain his perspective. Well respected by colleagues and patients alike, his skills are backed by a wealth of experience. Although his office is cluttered with an antique desk and 2 antique carved chairs, there is still room in the corner for 2 old bicycles. He prefers to pedal between the administration building and the hospital's security ward rather than take a car. Yes, it's quite a distance. It was quite a distance. I remember it, having visited myself. We had somebody there. Dr. Savage's colonial English accent is inherited from his family's life in India and his own training in Britain. He was born in central India in Nowong, where his father was a professional soldier and medical man, and his grandfather was principal of an Anglican boys' school in Bombay. Dr. Savage was named Patrick after an uncle who died in the Indian Army. Training as a doctor was one of 2 choices his father gave him. It was Sandhurst or medicine. Sandhurst is a military training school. Dr. Savage arrived in New Zealand from India in 1932. He attended King's College in Auckland, the Lawrence Royal Military School, and the University of Otago. In the Second World War, he commanded the 1st New Zealand Convalescent Depot in Italy. After returning from the war, he continued his medical career as general practitioner in charge of a 30-bed hospital in Ratahi, near Ohakune. 5 years later, he joined the staff of the Auckland Mental Hospital, now Oakley. Living in the isolation of the King Country, Dr. Savage says he found it a delight to live near the Point Chevalier shops in an old house next to Wolfe Home. So he was talking about the contrast between where he used to live in the country and living in the city in Auckland. It was then he decided to devote his career to psychiatry. It dawned on me that there would be plenty of surgeons after the war, but not many psychiatrists. There is a small picture, which will be very hard to see on this screen, which I shall show you in a minute, but its caption underneath it is Oakley Hospital Supervisor Dr. Pat Savage, on the left, takes time out to chat with a fellow staff member. And I will see if you can see it. There you go. There's Pat Savage, and there's the staff member in his office. I shall carry on reading. There's the start of a line that I don't have on this page, but he continues with the work I was doing at the Auckland Mental Hospital. During his first 5-year stint at the hospital, Dr. Savage furthered his studies at Auckland University. In 1956, he joined up as a surgeon in the Merchant Navy to see the world, but his travels ended in England, where, armed with a bursary, he began studying at Maudsley Hospital for 2 higher psychiatry degrees. He returned to the Auckland Mental Hospital, but was transferred to Sunnyside Hospital in Christchurch, where he spent 7 years as senior medical officer and then deputy superintendent. During the early 1960s, he became the first superintendent of Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital in Martin, but he returned to Auckland Mental Hospital in 1965 as superintendent. Dr. Savage says since then he has never had time to think of leaving the psychiatric field. He describes the hardest part of his job as the hours he works. With only 2 full-time doctors, he is permanently on call. As far as I am concerned, I find all the work interesting, he says. We are all here because we volunteered to work here. The only frustrating thing is we aren't doing things we know we could do because of lack of staff and money. He encouraged patients to enjoy the simple beauty of nature in the hospital grounds. Sorry, it's a little bit warm and I'm getting slightly itchy. Dr. Savage introduced the first ducks to the hospital duck pond. Since 1967, he has also been doing medical research, but all the work is in his spare time. I suppose it started because of the fact that some of the things I wanted to know were not in the textbooks, he said. In the early days, most of the research went into ordinary medicine. Now it is directed towards community psychiatry. Dr. Savage employs psychology graduates and undergraduates to help with the research, and they are paid through the Oakley Mental Health Research Foundation or through Labour Department's PEP scheme. His latest paper on drug abuse and death in Auckland was presented to the Royal New Zealand and Australian Institute of Psychiatry. Dr. Savage married 38 years ago and has 4 adult children and 1 granddaughter. Dr. Savage is due to retire in 1983, but what the future holds, he doesn't know. He plans to spend more time watercolour painting and fishing, but he will never abandon his fascination for the field of psychiatry. Most of those hesitations were because it was text written in a newspaper, and they have line breaks to make the text fit the column, and because it's for a newspaper, they will often have a hyphen or a break in a word before it goes to the next line, and sometimes it's a little hard to follow when the words are small to go from the end of one line to the next one and actually pick up on the rest of the word properly. And now we have various obituaries and articles from different newspapers and magazines. Continuing, this is the obituary of Jim Laidlaw, J.P. Jim was born in Heaton Chapel, England, between Manchester and Stockport, in 1910, and came to New Zealand with his parents in 1920. He was educated at King's College and later worked for 3 years with an exporting firm before going into fruit growing at Henderson. He later had an orchard of his own at Huapai. After he was married, he came back to Auckland and specialised in growing hothouse tomatoes at Mangere. He claims no formal studies in art. He did freelance cartooning for Sea Spray, Better Business, the Auckland Star, and the Russell Review. Better Business magazine had a high regard for his work, as shown by the following quote from the magazine around 1948. And then the quote goes thus: "The signature Laidlaw on illustrated humour has become well known throughout New Zealand in recent years, for James Laidlaw's work in lighter vein is gaining him thousands of followers. An unconventional artist, he first began to attract attention while in the army with illustrations for wall newspapers. On demobilisation, he began to pay more attention to his art, making it a hobby. He is an orchardist by profession, but the ability to draw was born in him, and as he couples this with a rapier-keen sense of humour, he seems to get a great deal of fun out of life. His drawings were hung," that's the end of that quote, "his drawings were hung in the cartoon exhibition of the Liverpool Festival in 1951, alongside the work of famous cartoonists such as Giles, James Thurber, and Charles Adams. Jim retired in 1966 and the family went to live at Russell. He took up sailing there and became Commodore of the Russell Boating Club. He was created a JP when chairman of the Russell Town Council. After 12 years in Russell, the family returned to Auckland as Mrs. Laidlaw was not well. They settled at Bucklands Beach. Jim came to live at Highlands Village in 1989 after his wife's death." And that's the end of it. And I'm not going to read them out to you, but there's a sample of 3 different illustrations that he had done as political cartoons or magazine cartoons, news cartoons. Next thing we have is, I think this is the obituary. Yes, this is the obituary of Patrick Philip Eric Savage from the New Zealand Medical Journal, the Journal of the New Zealand Medical Association, dated the 14th of March 2003, volume 116, number 1170. Patrick Philip Eric Savage. Dr. Patrick Savage, MBE, ED, MB, CHB, New Zealand, DPM, England, DPM of RCP and SI, FRANZCP, COP Psychology 3 of Auckland, died in Auckland on the 21st of November 2002 after a brief illness. He was born in Nowgong, Central India on the 5th of February 1918, the eldest child of Colonel and Mrs. Philip Savage. His father was a medical officer in the Indian Medical Service, and at the time Nowgong was a Turkish prisoner of war camp. Patrick commenced his education at the Lawrence Royal Military School, Sanawar, and then after the family migrated to New Zealand in 1932, continued at King's College, Auckland, from 1932 to 1935. From 1935, he studied at Otago University and graduated MB CHB in 1942. He then worked as a house surgeon in Wellington Hospital. In 1944, he married Margot Jerram, who was a medical student in the same year. After graduation, she practiced as a GP virtually continuously until shortly before her death in 1993. In 1945, Patrick enlisted in the NZEF and served as a medical officer in Italy, returning as a captain in 1946. He had joined the Otago University Medical Company, the OUMC, as a student, and so he continued to serve on the Territorial Army, listed as TF for Territorial Forces, I would imagine, after his return to New Zealand. His army connection was always a very important part of his life, and he was a familiar figure at TF camps until his retirement from the army in 1980 as a lieutenant colonel. On his return from overseas, he practiced as a GP in Owakuni, Ratahe, until 1948. In 1951, he took up an appointment at the then Avondale Mental Hospital and started his career in psychiatry. In 1955, he went to London to continue his studies, gaining a DPM RCP and RCS of Ireland, and DPM RCP and RCS from England. In 1956, he later gained a membership of the RANZCP in 1963 and was appointed a Fellow in 1986. On his return to New Zealand in 1956, he took up an appointment at Sunnyside Hospital near Christchurch, then in 1963 moved to Lake Alice. In 1965, Patrick was appointed Superintendent of Oakley Hospital and continued on as Superintendent of the Forensic Unit after the General Psychiatric Section was split off as a separate Carrington Hospital. He remained there until his retirement in 1983. He was well known as a leading forensic psychiatrist throughout New Zealand, and in the latter part of his professional life practiced almost exclusively in that field. His professional life was not without controversy. He was a man of strong principles, and he pursued these to the utmost if he felt that they were in the best interests of his patients. He opposed the government policy of closing down mental hospitals and releasing psychiatric patients into the community without adequate provisions for their care. These views made him unpopular with some sections of government. He was also Superintendent of Oakley during a period of industrial unrest and was instrumental in having the army called in to assist with patient care. This made him unpopular with the union. although he was always very concerned for the needs of his staff as well as for his patients. He was the final surviving member of a small group who, in 1967, established the Oakley Mental Health Research Foundation to mark the centenary of Oakley Hospital's first 100 years of service to the people of Auckland. He gathered together a number of prominent citizens who became initial founders. The trustees then set out to raise a fund for mental health research. The appeal was the first ever made for mental health research in New Zealand, and it is significant that he was still intensely interested in the work of the foundation until his death, and was present at the meeting on the 31st of October 2002, just before his death. Patrick was a committed Anglican and was involved with the Selwyn Society, which opposed certain modern trends in the Anglican Church. He was a very reserved person who had a great respect for people and was blessed with a wonderful family life. His main non-professional interest was trout fishing, which was usually conducted from the family holiday home at the edge of Lake Rotorua. He had an extremely happy married life with Margot, who was a real support to him during his professional career until she died in 1993. They had 4 children, Jill, Philippa, Christopher, and Debbie, and he is survived by all of them plus 4 grandchildren. In 1995, he married Daphne Sani, who was also a tremendous support and made his last years very happy. He was a true gentleman and was much respected by all who knew him well. We are grateful to Dr. Brian J. Linehan for this obituary. And there is a website address here, website www.ngmd.org.nz. And then it's got details how to log in. And I will leave that for you to look up or have someone look up for you. This one is from the New Zealand Medical Journal of the 9th of October 1985, and it's an obituary for Selwyn Hills. Selwyn Hills, a senior pathologist, died in Auckland on 4th of April 1984 at the age of 73. He was educated at Christ's College, King's College, and Cambridge University, and qualified from the Middlesex Hospital, London, in 1936. His postgraduate years included general practice in Reading and postgraduate studies in microbiology in London before returning to New Zealand. He was appointed assistant pathologist at Auckland Hospital in 1939 and commenced a long career in laboratory medicine at a time when specialization in single laboratory disciplines was unusual. Although he gained a wide experience in all branches of pathology, his predominant interest lay in microbiology and the developing field of immunology. In these areas, resources were scarce and equipment primitive by today's standards, but by his industry and ingenuity, he achieved a high standard of competence. His colleagues recall him returning somewhat dishevelled from a visit to the zoo, bearing a blood sample from a rhesus monkey, obtained after a strenuous pursuit through the large cage. This was for an attempt to repeat the newly published experimental work on the Rh factor. It was a do-it-yourself, make-it-yourself era in laboratories. His investigation into neonatal tetanus in 1948, I'm just checking, I'm not sure if it's 1948 or 1946. The original is very small, and I've got a photocopy printout of it, a laser printout of it, and it's not quite as clear as you'd like because it's done from newspaper print, which is made up of little dots, but I'll carry on with it. His investigations into neonatal tetanus in 1946 or 48 were in the best style of classical bacteriology, and he was a New Zealand pioneer in bone marrow examination. Following the retirement of Walter Gilmore in 1947, he became Director of Pathology and presided over the multidisciplinary course along which the Auckland Laboratory Services developed. His administrative style was low-key but shrewd and effective. He worked hard for the British Empire Cancer Campaign Society, Auckland Division, as a member and subsequently chairman of the controlling executive. He was instrumental in the organisation of the first New Zealand Cancer Conference in 1959. In 1961, he resigned his position and joined the late John Sullivan in private practice, commencing a new career characterised by administration from the bench. He was to spend the rest of his life in this field. John Sullivan had a particular interest in cytology, and following his death, Selwyn developed this discipline into one of his major concerns. These brief biographical details necessarily omit reference to the real nature of Selwyn Hills, who will be remembered as one of the characters of Auckland medicine. Many things about him were paradoxical. He was a good laboratory administrator, but never lost the common touch in his relations with colleagues and staff at all levels, who respected and liked him despite, or more probably because of, his complete lack of pretentiousness, sartorial and otherwise. At times he exhibited a mild and genial eccentricity, leaving his friends wondering what new enthusiasms were about to emerge. These ranged from boat building to fish retailing to farming. All his activities were characterized by careful attention to design and homework, and not a few became the stuff of anecdote. In contrast with these practical pursuits, another side of his nature was manifest in his studies in comparative philosophy, religion, and history. In his last years, Selwyn was affected by a complex and unrelenting pathology which reduced him to first a single and then a double lower limb amputee. He bore these troubles with characteristic cheerfulness and courage, as well as a determination that his professional routine and lifestyle were not to be compromised by physical setbacks. Almost to the last, he attended the laboratory daily, initially driving his modified vehicle, characteristically a utility, not a saloon. When this got beyond him, there was no shortage of volunteers among the staff to transport him. He was the friend of them all. We are indebted to Dr. D.J.A. Doyle for this obituary. On to the next. John Rose, 14/3/20, 31/5/11, AGS obituary. John D. Rose, 34, was actively involved with grammar for 78 years as an old boy, a parent, and grandfather. After serving in World War II in the Pacific, North Africa, and Italy, John established a public accounting practice in Auckland. He was then appointed to head Marac Finance Limited, which grew into New Zealand's leading non-bank financial institution prior to its sale in 1986. John retained a lifetime relationship with the Army, Auckland Rotary, and the New Zealand Institute of Chartered Accountants, and was awarded a CBE in 1986 for services to business and the community. And that is the end of the obituaries and news articles, and now we have some letters. See? Handwritten. Dear Eva, herewith my famous life story, and this is dated the 10th of the 11th of the 11th. Herewith my famous life story, intended for family consumption, but thank you for expressing interest. Let me know when you have had time to look through it, and I will call to collect it. Best wishes, Daphne. And then here is a reply dated a week or two later. Here it is. 21st the 11th, 11. Dear Daphne, thanks very much for letting me read your life story. I feel privileged to be allowed the glimpses into your memories. It made for interesting reading. Kind regards, Eva. 2 p.m. 8/8/11. Dear Daphne, congratulations of a life well spent. I feel as though I've been around the world almost in the last half hour. Beautifully told and presented, and what a life to look back upon. Amazing. Thanks, B. And that's the end of the reading. Thank you for listening. and I do hope you've enjoyed looking back. Bye.